Welcome to Books and Beyond with ThatGuyJae. I am, of course, ThatGuyJae. This is going to be another solo podcast this week. This is actually our last podcast of the year. Christmas is over and New Year's is quickly approaching. We're kind of in that purgatory week between them where nobody really knows what's going on. We made a little switch up this week. We moved the podcast from Friday to Monday. It's going to be on Mondays for the foreseeable future. This just seems to fit into my schedule a little bit better in terms of release dates. But anyways, today what we're going to do is go over my reading year. I figured this was a great time to wrap up my reading. I printed out a little bit of information here because I wasn't going to remember it all. But what I have here is just some of my basic reading stats from Storygraph. That's my preferred app for tracking my reading. And then I've also gone through all of the books I read, and I've come up with a best and worst from each month. I don't love saying worst because I didn't read many bad books this year. There's only a couple that I even rated below 3 out of 5 stars. So for the books that I chose for that, I wouldn't even say they were bad, and most of them I would still recommend. They just happened to be the lowest rated book of that month. But for starters, let's get into some statistics. As of recording, it's currently Sunday, December 29th, 2024. I have read 104 books. Those 104 books were 35,636 pages. My breakdown between physical book, ebook, and audiobook is 42% physical, 10% digital, and 48% audio. This is actually a big increase in my audio reading compared to last year. And I think that's 100% due to Libby, and I absolutely love it. It has given me the opportunity to read so many more books in situations where I couldn't have a physical book in front of my face. If you don't utilize Libby and Hoopla, you absolutely should. They are amazing. You can get ebooks from them as well and read them on your Kindle. It is an absolute game changer. I cannot recommend it enough. On that note, if you don't go to the library, I can't recommend that enough either. You need a library card to access Libby and Hoopla, so go to your local library, get a library card, and check out a few books while you're there. The library is amazing. I did not use it for years, and I was missing out big time. Next, this is no surprise to myself, but my most read genre was fantasy with 37 books, and my least read genre was politics with 1 book. This was a little bit of a surprise to me, but then again, not so much because I read a lot of fantasy, but 60% of my books read this year were over 500 pages. I did read a bunch of chunky books, and I absolutely love them. The remaining 40% were under 300 pages. And those are just the basic overall statistics. So now let's get into a month-by-month breakdown with my highest rated book from each month and my lowest rated book from each month. I started the year off pretty slow. I only read 3 books in January. It was 1,432 pages. I went kind of hard at the end of last year to try and reach a goal. And I think I might have burnt myself out a little bit, so I only read 3 books for January, but they were all great reads. The lowest rated was Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton, and I rated that 4 stars. This is a sci-fi book that I would absolutely recommend. I had a great time with this book. I actually read book 2 this year as well. It just wasn't quite as good as what my number 1 best book for the month was, and that was A Man Called Ove by Frederick Bachman. That was a 5-star read for me. I highly recommend that one. You may cry. It's a very emotional book, but it has fantastic characters, and that one was a great, great read. It was a really nice way to start the year with that in January. I greatly upped my reading in February because I felt like I slacked in January. So for February, I read 14 books, totaling 3,825 pages. My lowest rated book of the month was The Blood Gift by N.E. Davenport. I rated that 3.75 stars. That was a book 2 in a series. I didn't hate this book. I just felt like the story fell off a lot as compared to book 1. I still enjoyed it. I'm still going to continue the series if there is a book 3. I can't remember if there is or not. But yeah, it just wasn't my favorite. Now for my highest rated book of February, I read Kindred in February, and Kindred is my favorite book of all time. I read that at least once a year. It feels a little cheaty to have that as my best read of the month, though, because it's always going to be the best, whatever month I read it in. So I went with Rage of the Dragons by Evan Winters as my other choice for best read of February. Rage of the Dragons is a fantastic start to a African-inspired fantasy series. It is all gas, no brakes, huge revenge story. Highly recommend. It's definitely worth checking out. Now, in March, I read 10 books, and that was 3,812 pages. My lowest rated of the month was Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee, and I rated that 3.75 stars. Again, it was a novella, actually, and it wasn't one that I hated. It was okay. I think compared to her other works that I've read, it didn't quite hold up, but I think a lot of that had to do with it being so short. There just wasn't a lot of time to really expand upon the world. My best read of March was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, and this was a 5-star read for me. This one was really surprising. I think this technically falls under the category of magical realism. It had really good character work, it had a fantastic story, and it had a really surprising animal companion, if you will. Highly recommend this one as well. This was a fantastic read. In April, I read 7 books, 2,686 pages. My lowest rated book of the month was Dragonflight by Anne McAfee. This is in the Dragon Riders of Pern series. This is book 1, and I just really didn't vibe with this. I actually don't even know if I'm going to continue the series. I rated this one 3.5 stars. It just kind of wasn't for me. And my best read of the month was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagara. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. This book might be a little bit controversial. I know a lot of people refer to this book as trauma corn, and I can kind of see where they're coming from. This is a very heavy book. It is very focused on trauma, but I think this book is so much more. And I read this book at a time where I think I really needed something like this. I had a lot going on in April. I actually bought myself this book for my birthday, and I read it in April because it just felt right. While there is a lot of trauma in this book, I also think that this is a beautiful book. It explores decades of friendship among 4 men living in New York City. I do tend to like books in New York City. There's no secret there. And although this was a 5-star read for me, I'm not sure that this is a book that I would ever reread. And it's not a book that I ever recommend because this is a very, very heavy book. It's very dark at times. If you are interested, I absolutely recommended checking triggers and just know that it's going to get dark. But for me, it was an amazing read. I'm so glad I read it. I think it's so much more than trauma corn, and yeah, I enjoyed it in a very sad kind of way. Moving on to May, I read 8 books in May, 3,545 pages. My lowest rated read of the month was Hey Hun by Emily Lynn Paulson, and this was a nonfiction about MLMs. I rated this one 3.5 stars. It wasn't a bad read. I think I've just seen enough documentaries and heard enough about MLMs that there was nothing really new in it. It was an okay read. There was some interesting stuff in it, but yeah, kind of just rehashing the stuff that I already knew about MLMs. And for my best read of the month, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to do a tie. I can't decide. They're in the same series, so yeah, kind of same. And that would be Jade War and Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. This is book 2 and book 3 in the Greenbone saga, and I absolutely binged through these back to back, read both of them in about a week and a half. I could not put these down. I think the Greenbone saga might be the best trilogy I've ever read. I cannot recommend this series enough if you're at all interested in fantasy. I know some people have disagreed with me on this, but I think that this would be a great entry point into fantasy because it is an urban fantasy. It is a fictional world, but it's not so different than the world we live in. So there's not a ton of world building that you have to get through to understand what's going on. But yeah, both of these were 5-star reads. I can't pick which one I liked more. So they were both my best read of the month. That brings us to June, where I read 5 books, 2,938 pages. My lowest rated read of the month was Ice Planet Barbarians by Ruby Dixon. This was the first spicy book I ever read. And boy, was it an introduction to this genre. Wow, I was not prepared. I did buddy read this, so that made it more enjoyable. I didn't hate it. I rated it 3.5 stars. It is pretty wild, though. I don't know that I would recommend this to people who aren't already spicy readers. But, I mean, it was definitely an experience. This year, I definitely was focused on expanding my genres and stepping outside my comfort zone, and this one took me there. No issue. My best read for June was a really hard decision because I read 2 books that absolutely blew me away. So we'll go with my honorable mention, which was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. The reason I didn't choose this as my top read for the month is because I've read enough Brandon Sanderson and I've heard enough about this series to know that I was going to love it. It was as good as everybody says, and I flew through this book. I read all 1,200 pages of it in 7 days. It was fantastic, but it was an expected fantastic. Now, the book that I ended up choosing for my top read of the month was 11/22/63 by Stephen King. This was another hefty book at, I believe, 800 or 900 pages. And I've read a good amount of Stephen King, and I was confident that I would like this one. I had heard positive things about it, but I was not expecting to love it the way I did. I was absolutely blown away by this book. This was probably my surprise read of the year. I loved it so much. I couldn't believe how good the characters were. I was amazed by the journey that we went on in this story. I highly recommend this one. Even if you're not a Stephen King reader usually, there's no horror involved in this. It's just a fantastic, interesting story. On to July, where I read 8 books, 4,169 pages. My lowest rated read of this month was Barbarian Alien, which was book 2 in the Ice Planet Barbarian series. This series, I believe, has something like 30 or 40 or even more books, and I stopped after book 2. Several people told me that I should keep going with the series, and it was kind of more of the same. It's definitely for spicy readers. I found myself enjoying it less than the first one. I don't know that I'll continue with this series, but I'm not mad that I stopped into this world. I'm still very new to this genre, so yeah. My top read for July was The Will of the Many by James Islington. This was one that I saw all spring, all over Book Talk, and everyone was hyping this up so much as like the fantasy of the year. I had high hopes for it. I was a little nervous going in that it wasn't going to live up to my expectations, but it did. This was a 5-star read for me. This is absolutely fantastic. I cannot wait for book 2. If you're at all interested in fantasy, definitely check it out if you haven't already. On to August, where I read 6 books, 2,415 pages. My lowest rated read of the month was a nonfiction called Unleash the Power of Storytelling. It wasn't a bad book, but this was focused on sales and business and how to tell a story to get your point across. And there was some useful information, but it was nothing groundbreaking. My top read of the month was The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. I had a great time with this book. I've always heard good things about it. I ended up rating this one 4.5 stars. It was much wittier and funnier than I was anticipating. It's at its core, it's a heist story. It's very fun. It's very exciting. Has great characters. Definitely recommend. In September, I read 7 books, 2,367 pages. My lowest rated book for the month was called The Nature of Witches by Rachel Griffin. This was actually one of my reads for my book club that I'm in. And this wasn't awful, but it just kind of fell short for me. It started strong. The first 50 to 75 pages were very intriguing. And then I feel like it just kind of fell off, and it landed in so many cool paths it could have taken. And I believe this was a YA, and it read very YA in the romance department at least, but I think it kind of just lost the plot. My highest rated read for September was Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly, but wow, this book blew me away. This was another book that was highly hyped up by Book Talk, and I got on board with this one a little late, but I buddy read this one and had a fantastic time with it. I'm at my core a sci-fi guy, and I read a ton of fantasy as well, and this is an amazing combination of both. It is definitely sci-fi, but it reads very much like a fantasy, and it actually has fantasy elements in it. If you like either sci-fi or fantasy, I highly recommend this. If you're only a fantasy reader, I still think you'll enjoy this one. This was a 4.5-star read for me. It was almost 5 stars, but I knocked half a point off just because there was a little bit in the middle that I think could have been trimmed off, just a little extra fat there. But I've heard the series only gets better. For October, I read 6 books, 2,218 pages. My lowest rated book of this month was actually my lowest rated book of the year, and that was Broken Bonds by Jay Bree. This was another book club book, and unfortunately, this one was a huge miss for me. I rated this 1.5 stars. This was supposed to be a spicy book, and I've heard that this series gets spicier as it goes on, but it read very much like YA, which was kind of weird for me to have spice mixed in with YA. Those are two things that I don't think should go together. But not only did the characters read very immature, the writing seemed very immature, and it just seemed like a whole lot of nothing happened. And the things that did happen, I just didn't love. This was a big skip for me. I will not be continuing this series. My highest rated read for the month was The Devil Takes You Home by Gabino Iglesias. This was a 5-star read for me. This was one of those books where I just kind of had to stare at the wall for a few minutes once I was done. This book was advertised, at least from what I saw, as a horror, but I think this was more than that. It definitely got very dark. It definitely had some creepy scenes. It had some scenes that were honestly so hard to read. The overall messages in this book were amazing. This was very heavy, but it's definitely one that I would recommend. In November, I read 6 books, 2,449 pages. My lowest rated read of the month was The Dragon's Bride by Katie Roberts. This one was way outside my wheelhouse. This is what people refer to as monster smut, and it turns out that is not at all for me. I did not have a good time with this one. It wasn't the worst book I read all year, but monster and humans getting it on was a bit too much for me. Do not recommend unless that's your thing already. My highest rated book of the month was The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. This was the final book in the Poppy War trilogy. I absolutely love this trilogy. This one wasn't quite 5 stars for me. I rated it 4.75. It felt like parts dragged on a little bit, but overall, it was an amazing book. This trilogy was fantastic and one that I highly recommend. If you do choose to read it, know that it is going to get pretty dark at points. This is definitely dark fantasy, and it has some heavy themes. And that brings us to this month. December isn't quite over yet, but I can confidently say that I have my lowest rated and highest rated books already read. I'm only probably going to get one more book in before the end of the month. This month, I went very crazy. I saved up a bunch of shorter stories and novellas, and I knew I wanted to finish the year strong. I was close to hitting 100 books for the year, so I wanted to make sure I did that. And as of the time of recording, I have read 24 books this month, 3,780 pages. Like I said, a lot of these were shorter books, but there were still some really good ones in the mix. My lowest rated book of the month was called The Promise of an Angel by Ruth Reed, and I rated this 3 stars. This was an Amish romance. I found out about this genre in my comment section in kind of a hilarious way and committed to the bit of reading anything at least once. I had to read it. I read it for the meme. It wasn't terrible. I've read worse, but it was very boring, and it was kind of exactly what you would expect Amish romance to be. Do not recommend. I don't think that this genre will ever be for me, and I don't know who this genre is for, to be honest, but there's a lot of them, so some people must like it. I don't know. And my highest rated book of the month was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I haven't read this book in a very long time, at least 10, maybe 15 years. And I did an immersive read of this book. Immersive reading has become my favorite way to read. And the narrator for the audiobook was Andy Serkis, and he did a phenomenal job. If you're interested in this book, either for the first time or a reread, I highly recommend doing an immersive read and find the audio with him as the narrator. It is so good. This was easily a 5-star read for me. This has really motivated me to want to do a Lord of the Rings reread next year because I haven't read Lord of the Rings in probably 20 years. I haven't seen the films in probably 10. I think that's something that's going to be high on my priority list for 2025 is reading the 3 books and watching the movies as well. I think that would be a great time. So there it is. That's a wrap on my reading year. Like I said, I'm currently reading The Toll, which is book 3 in the Arc of the Scythe trilogy, and I'm going to try and finish that by New Year's. So hopefully I'll finish with 105 books for the year. This is by far the most books I've ever read in a year. This is one of the best reading years of my life. I read more diversely this year in terms of genre than I ever have, and I had a fantastic time. It's been really fun to kind of step outside my usual sci-fi and fantasy bubble and experience some new things. I read a lot of stuff outside of my genres that I really liked. I read a lot of stuff outside my genres that was just okay, and I read a few that I really disliked. But I had a great time stepping out of my normal comfort zone. I definitely recommend everybody do that every now and then. I think it's good to step outside of your normal reading areas, try some new things, expand what you're reading. There's so many amazing books out there, and there's so many amazing books that exist outside of genres that I normally read that I never would have heard about if it weren't for Book Talk. It's one of my favorite things about Book Talk is getting so many different recommendations from different types of readers. But I think that's probably a wrap on this week. I hope everyone had an amazing holiday season. If you celebrate Christmas, I hope you had a great one. New Year's is just a couple days away. If you go out, be safe. Get a designated driver. Don't do anything crazy. You don't need to start 2025 in any kind of trouble. Next episode, I think we're actually probably going to go over some of my reading goals for 2025 and just my general life goals, goals for this podcast, goals for social media. Just start 2025 off on a strong foot. I know this podcast came about at the end of 2024. I'm really excited for 2025 with Books and Beyond. I can't wait to get a full year of the podcast under my belt. I am lining up more guests for the coming weeks. It was a little bit hard to schedule myself and schedule people around the holidays, which I totally understand. But the holidays are almost over, and then we can get back to having some indie authors on and having other book talkers on. I think I'd even like to get some watch creators on here and discuss that. On that note, I almost forgot. I was supposed to start the podcast with this. My watch of the day today is the Casio Duro, and it's on a James Bond-inspired NATO strap. But yeah, I can't wait to expand on this podcast and this community in 2025. I hope everybody had a fantastic year, and I will see you next time.